It's always really nice to get a round of applause before having done anything at all. My name is Christian Danielsen. I am the director of the Arts Council of Norway, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting. This summit is being organized by us by assignment of the Ministry of Culture and Equality, and very shortly you'll meet the Minister, Anette Trettebergstuen. She is the actual hostess. But please just consider me a warm-up number, basically. Welcome to Norway and very, very welcome to Deichman Library. It's no secret that I am particularly fond of this particular building. Before I became the director of the Arts Council of Norway, I was the director of the library right here. And we very much feel that the library is the ideal place for a talk about the Nordics. Libraries are a low threshold service for everybody interested in culture. Everybody and anyone is welcome here. This is a place for freedom of movement and expression and inspiration. Since 2017, the libraries have been an open arena and an independent meeting place and a space for public debate. That means that the libraries are an important part of the infrastructure in order to maintain a well-informed public debate. And please don't think that I'm here to speak the case of the libraries, but I'm doing this to emphasize that the values on which the libraries build truly parallel the values of the Nordic cooperation. The Nordic countries are very much characterized by equality, openness, and the fact that we truly value freedom of expression. These principles and values are something that we tend to take for granted here in these very peaceful Nordics and the Nordic hemisphere indeed. But if the last few months have taught us anything, it is that we cannot take this kind of thing for granted and that we really need to work to protect and safeguard our cooperation. The Nordic cooperation has long, good and positive traditions. We like to think of art and culture being the very cornerstone of this cooperation. We all have some shared reference points ranging from Pippi Longstocking, the Moomin Trolls, Saga Norén, Karl Ove Knausgård, and of course the series Skam. Oh, there's a Swede nodding. That's very good. These are all part of our shared Nordic cultural heritage that unite us. And today, that we are gathered here under this umbrella, we have a lot to talk about. We have all just gone through the pandemic, which, as we know, had a tremendous negative impact on the arts in the Nordics. So we need to learn from what we've just gone through. So we've now joined here today a very broad range of politicians of the arts and actors, players in the field that can tell us about the arts sector. These are things that we have in common here in the Nordics. We all love knowledge, and we have systematically developed research and knowledge communities in the Nordics, which are now, for the first time ever, united here today. We believe quite deeply that systematic sharing of knowledge and culture can better equip the cultural sector to rebuild ourselves after the pandemic, to become more sustainable and to be ready to face new changes, because one thing is sure, change will come yet again. We have seen that this year war has broken out in Europe far too close to us, and that means that the Nordic governments must now be ready to address completely new macro-political situations and challenges. And in the wake of this, we have received signals that our budgets may well be leaner going forward. And this brings us in the Nordic cultural collaboration to some dilemmas, because while we see that our financial situation may well be affected, the ambitions for Nordic cooperation continue to be as high as ever, also at the national level. And we should be very satisfied with this. We want to make up for lost time after 2 years of pandemic. We must remember that we produce arts and art of the utmost quality. We promote equality and we promote sustainability. Everybody in this room, we work on this on a day-to-day basis. But how can we prioritize our tasks? How can we weigh and balance all these different missions and assignments that we have, while at the same time safeguarding and upholding the artistic freedom of expression? these are things we'll have ample opportunity to discuss today. There are lots of people over here today, and we have several viewers and listeners online following us digitally. It is important to remember that our artists are the very core of our cooperation, and these are values that we all share. I wish you all a good and truly inspiring day here together, and I hope we will learn more about why the Nordic cultural cooperation is not only important, but in fact more important than it has ever been before. Now, I wish you all a wonderful day. I would now like to present to you Jonas Ekeberg, who is today's host. Dear all of you, welcome to the conference about the Nordic cultural collaboration after the pandemic. I would like to thank Director Kristin Danielsen, who, as she said, is the director of the Arts Council of Norway. My name is Jonas Ekeberg, and I am responsible for visual arts at the Arts Council of Norway. And it is my job today to guide you through this program. I am one of those people who truly loves and admires Nordic cultural cooperation, not only because I'm half Swedish, half Norwegian, or because I've studied in 3 Nordic countries and have worked in at least 5 Nordic countries, but because I have experienced the amazing positive effect of the Nordic cooperation on arts and art itself. But there is another reason why I find this Nordic collaboration so interesting, and that's because it's quite difficult. Certainly in my area, it is quite difficult because I work on visual arts. I hate Nordic art and Nordic landscapes, said the Danish artist Per Kirkeby once. And he said this in the midst of elaborating on how his art was in fact very much characterized by these Nordic elements. He describes it as a sort of protoplasmic thing that probably levitates around the air, floats around in the air where you grow up. He referred to a Nordic critic had called the Nordic arts a quasi-fascistic myth. Somebody else called the Nordic arts community a romantic piece of self-deception. Strong words, it must be said. And of course, all these words were expressed in a very specific context. These words fell at the beginning of the 1990s when Nordic art changed its nature. It moved from a very serious pathos marked in the 80s, and it became more playful. At the time, one then moved to distance oneself from the idea of something specifically Nordic, because while Nordic art and Nordic cooperation create certain salages, but no, in fact, it keeps on being rediscovered and reinvented. So surely the conclusion must be that the idea of the Nordics or something Nordic continues subject to continuous change. It's not one stable thing, but something that is changeable. And we need to turn it into something profitable. I thought this was a Danish word that I just used, but it turns out to be an ancient Norse word. It is a pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you the Norwegian Minister of Culture and Equality, Anette Trettebergstuen.
Thank you very much. So through all this year, I was privileged to have a very remarkable hat as a mayor or the leader of the Nordic Council of Ministers, as a chair of this, and which I really enjoyed, and what I'm going to enjoy a bit more to the end of the year until I pass this hat to my Icelandic colleague, and she is there with us on streaming. So welcome to you, Lina Alfredsdottir. She is a Minister of Tourism, Culture in Iceland, and is taking this initiative from New Year. Greenland's Minister of Culture was going to meet here us today, but he was hindered by a flight strike, so we are sending him a digital greeting. And I'm also very happy to know that Mara Bray is with us. She has come all the way from Canada and leading a work with the biggest involving of cultural exchange, Nordic Bridges, which has been operating through this fantastic year. Jonas, you were right saying that the Nordic operation is something special. And of course, it's supposedly more than policy and culture and directions. And there is something we are creating together. And all of you present here have contributed to present these initiatives through this work. And therefore, I wish all you cordial welcome and thank you for all the contributions and efforts you have put down to promote culture. And last but not the least, Arts Council Norway, Kristin, thank you for the initiative to carry out this conference. This is an exciting possibility. And I would like to use this possibility to mark the Arts Council Norway, not only in our country, but also internationally, even though the November may seem dull and boring. When some of us met in Helsingfors some days ago to present the awards from the Arts Council Norway, the moderator of that day underlined that the Nordic fear, something that's called Nordic fear there, and to combat that, we have come together and collaborate on Nordic joy. We are going to present our experiences and what we have enjoyed and how it has changed through the pandemic and for the lockdown of the cultural life. We are going to look forward and what can we do together. We are also going to ask each other and discuss what shall we do with this Nordic operation? What can we and what should we do? In the Nordic Fellowship, we all have set rather ambitious goals. Northern Europe has to be the most sustainable and integrated region until before 2030. And all cooperation that we do in the Nordic Council of Ministers will contribute to achieve this very goal. And definitely cultural life is going to be involved when we are going to work on the environmental change and socially environmental or sustainable work. And culture is one of the solutions on the way there. A very rich and diverse cultural life is a prerequisite of involving and including fellowship. Our goal is to achieve when we're achieving integrated North, we have to involve language, culture, and arts in our neighboring countries and working together with them. Our goal is to put forward the Nordic arts and culture and to present Northern as a competitive and attractive cultural region. Apart from that, Norwegian goals are built around the cooperation program. When I presented Northern priorities for 2020 last November, I remember we were calculating that pandemic was passing and it was coming to an end, but it did not happen. We got another round of the pandemic, which brought consequences for the whole cultural life in our country and in neighboring countries. And the consequences were also deteriorating our plans and our events like Nordic Bridges in Toronto that already had been exposed to some deterioration. And we were, of course, very disappointed when we had to postpone or cancel another event. As a chair, I felt that cultural cooperation was very important and it has to be highlighted in the years to come. And in the center of that cooperation was those common Nordic events in Canada, like Nordic Bridges, and also language cooperation, indigenous population, and diversity. The last is the first. Nordic ministers are very engaged in solving challenges that are connected with the technological giant or dominance in media. These are the problems that are global, international, and very encompassing. Now, in this October, we arranged a joint Nordic conference in Oslo about the technical giant's influence on the democratic discourse and what the consequences does it have for the free media that our world is based on here in the north. We have been presented a report that was ordered by the Nordic Council of Ministers. We also had a think tank that is going to present its results in April, how to improve the intervening of the technical giants. We are also working on safeguarding Sami culture, and it also represents a cooperation and a fellowship across the borders. And the Norwegian chairmanship was a visible presentation of all arenas of cooperation. The Sami culture is a part of our cultural diversity and presented in all spheres in the north. Today we are also going to learn about possibilities about Sami culture or indigenous populations culture here in our countries. This makes me happy. And now the pandemic is over. Knock the wood. And in Norway and other Nordic countries, we have managed quite well after the pandemic, and this is because of our economic muscles and possibility to support artists. Today we're going to listen to the results and the report on supporting culture. Nordic Council of Ministers ordered in 2021 a report that was going to disclose the schemes of support after the pandemic, and I'm looking forward to listen to the results of this cooperative effort. But the most interesting, how these challenges will color our cooperation in future. Many events have colored our work in 2022, like in 2021 was the pandemic. Now we are under the war, Ukraine, and the energy prices are rising, and the climate crisis is getting bigger. What do these changes? How do they change our cooperation and our cultural cooperation in future? As a culture minister in equality, I have a responsibility to provide infrastructure for cultural and artistic expression on the national level. In addition, we have to provide a Nordic network as a prerequisite of a strong and competitive cultural life across the borders. As a chair of the Nordic Council of Ministers, I would like to underline that the cultural sector itself wants to be a driving force in this cultural cooperation, because the national authorities have to provide this very infrastructure so that the cultural sector would be free and independent. But the cultural sector itself has to show the direction and be the driving force. I know that you people who are present here are showing the direction and are the driving force, and make my experience of being your chair fantastic. And it is really inspiring to see what is happening around us. This day is also a meeting point and an arena of developing our cooperation. You meet new people, have new ideas, and I'm confident that this will inspire us in future. Thank you very much and have a very fantastic day. Thank you, Annette Trettebergstuen. How difficult can it this Nordic thing be for arts and artists? And the answer is very difficult. Let's let's step 200 years back in artistic academy in Copenhagen. The biggest question in that time was, can motifs from Nordic mythology be used in education, or should we keep to the antique and Christian scope of motives, like this Roman art and so on? What was important for the king? Because in 1814, the king has said that the academy should educate in Nordic mythology, and the state needed heroes in the aftermath of the Napoleon's wars. And what more is more national than the Nordic? But many artists, also on the inside of the academy, disliked it strongly. In the Nordic mythology, the arts would find its own grave. And Mallarens have heard that someone you know meant that the Nordic motives only will give something to barbarism and idols. And you know, the Crown Prince Christian Fredrik and Høyen were dismissed, and the Nordic mythology was introduced into the academy. And this professional decision, like today, are now being taken, luckily not by the king. I should wish the news Wendell welcome here, but he is not able to participate. Therefore, Eva Engelund is a perfect substitute to present his speech. So it is from the Department of Equality and Cooperation, Natural Resources and Culture. What more can it be in Copenhagen?
Well, first of all, I bring warm greetings from the Acting General Secretary, Jonas Wendel, who unfortunately fell ill. It is November, after all. These things do happen, sadly. Dear ministers, dear friends, first of all, I would like to thank Minister Therese Bergstuen for taking the initiative to this meeting, this summit, as part of the Norwegian presidency of the Nordic Ministers' Council. Thank you to the listeners for coming to spend this day at this important meeting to learn more about our experience and the knowledge that we've gained after the pandemic. I look forward to discussions on the roles of the arts and the power of community and the arts in such a situation. In the Nordics, we work for a strong and diverse cultural collaboration. The importance of cultural exchange and linguistic understanding, that was the very basis for the establishment of the Nordic Council of Ministers. This was set out in the Helsinki Agreement, and it says there that the organization should promote the enjoyment of film, theatre, literature, and other forms of art. The Nordic artistic collaboration has come to express a very visible Nordic cooperation. We have Nordic prizes, we have the Nordic Film and Television Fund, we have the the Arts Fund, we have joint Nordic cultural institutions, we have the Sami Council, and these are all important examples of Nordic initiatives, joint Nordic initiatives that promote the arts. As the minister mentioned, we have a vision that by 2030 the Nordic should be the world's most sustainable region, and this is all built on that strong feeling of community and loyalty to one another that ultimately is built on the shared values that we hold in the Nordics and that shared cultural identity of which the joint belief in human rights is a key component. So this is really about the relationships between individuals, but also between the individual and the state. And here, culture and the arts play an important role in strengthening this relationship by promoting dialogue, trust, and mutual reciprocal exchange. The Nordic cultural cooperation makes it possible for players in the arts to reach out to a broader public than they could in just the one country, and also for the artistic players to be shaped and influenced by a larger context than they have at their disposal in their own country. So, in that sense, the Nordic collaboration also forms a stepping stone towards a more international community or audience, and in that sense, it's a true stepping stone. So, the Nordics have become and continue to be an attractive cultural region. And this cooperation strengthens the Nordic trademark. This initiative has also promoted communication between relevant policymakers, organizations, authorities, between the different Nordic countries. So this is yet again a good example of how culture can help inform broader societal developments. So, dear friends, the cultural players, as we know, the arts were hit very badly by the pandemic. The producers, the organizers, the event holders lost their economic sustenance, basis of sustenance, due to the various restrictions on social and artistic activities, all done with a view to combating contagion. So, in the various countries, the effect of the lockdown is something that we have been monitoring in the Nordic Council of Ministers. And we have looked at how crisis management has affected not only the arts, but also society at large. The ministers discussed this particular aspect of the restrictions as early as the spring of 2020. There was talk of reinforcing the financial support for the arts for Nordic players, and there was discussion on how the pandemic was affecting the arts and also the medium of the news. In 2021, the Enestam report was published. This was a report commissioned by the Nordic Council of Ministers as part of the Nordic cooperation. And this was about how the pandemic was handled and how the Nordic cooperation could improve our civil preparedness and prepare us better to meet similar challenges in the future. This report raised the question of the significance of Nordic cultural collaboration and, moreover, the understand of how our shared understanding is built up by our shared cultural experiences. This sense of a joint identity is built both on shared day-to-day experience but also on cultural experiences. The stronger this sense of shared identity is, the easier it is to collaborate in the kinds of challenges that we've been facing. So it should be remembered that the objective of creating collaboration in arts is not only an objective in its own right, but it also is important for promoting other objectives, such as other types of cooperation. So the focus on the arts was not only something that happened in each individual country, but this also became an important part for the Nordics as a whole and part of the work of the Council of Ministers of the Nordics. Cultural activities have the potential within themselves to promote sustainability and a sense of joint identity. And the Nordic Council of Ministers is now trying to look at what we can do to achieve that vision of being the most integrated and sustainable region in the world by 2030. And we're hoping to launch a plan about this in 2025. So everybody in the Nordics should, of course, have the possibility to express themselves freely and participate freely in cultural activities. That means that we must listen very carefully to children and young people's voices. They are important here and now, not only in the future. Children and young people and their access to cultural experiences, including cultural activities as part of their leisure time activities, were very strongly restricted during the pandemic. But now we can go back to enjoying a more normal cultural activities. But there were many children that lost out on that normal, ordinary connection to artistic activities and cultural activities when they started in years 1 and 2 at school. So involving children and making sure that children have access to culture to reestablish that is one of the important things you want to discuss over this afternoon. And we need to look at how this affected children individually and young people individually, but also societally. So it is therefore important to emphasize that the pandemic triggered not only a health crisis, but also an identity crisis. And if we're going to talk about identity, of course, art and culture are very important, also in order to promote our health, our freedom of expression, and our identity and sense of community in the Nordics. So just to conclude, I would like to encourage everybody here to continue our work to promote a strong and inclusive cultural life for everybody in the Nordics. Thank you so much for your attention. That means I have to thank both Jonas Wendel and you, Eva Englund, for giving the speech.
International timeline to the contemporary Nordic exhibitions, without mentioning the regional history of large-scale art exhibitions, which dates back to the 1850s, just like the exhibition in London. In 1857, for example, there was one here in Oslo, and those of you who are still interested and able to find art criticism in today's world of publishing will be amused to learn that a 25-year-old Bjørnstjerne Bjørnson, 2 years before he wrote the national hymn, Ja, vi elsker, studied this Nordic exhibition in Oslo for 3 months. I think it's very ambitious, and wrote 4 full-page articles, all printed on the front page of the Norwegian paper Morgenbladet, explaining the similarities and differences between each work from the various Nordic countries in detail. What I'm saying is that Nordic art and culture needs Nordic references, but it would certainly suffocate if it did not cultivate international relations as well. And the next speaker is no stranger to international relations. Please welcome to the stage Mara Bray, former director of the Sydney Biennial, so it had some meaning, this talk about art exhibitions, I hope. Currently director of the Harbourfront Centre in Toronto, and host for this year's great Nordic cultural initiative, Nordic Bridges.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. I respectfully acknowledge the Sami as one people and as the indigenous people of the Fenno-Scandian region. On the land of this region, Sápmi, the Sami people have lived since time immemorial, respectfully harvesting from nature by fishing, farming, hunting and following reindeer, amongst other activities. I'm Mara Bray, the Chief Executive Officer of Harbourfront Centre in Toronto. And what I just did was a land acknowledgement. Some of you may have seen this, some of you may not have. It's a formal statement that recognises and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. For non-Indigenous communities, land acknowledgement is a way of showing respect and honouring Indigenous peoples of the land on which we work and live. And acknowledgement is part of resisting the erasure of Indigenous histories. And it's something that I was very familiar and undertook a lot in Australia, and then now when I'm working in Canada, and then of course when I visit any country that actually has an Indigenous past and an Indigenous present and an Indigenous future. So I thank you for having me here on your land. Thank you also to Minister Tretbergstuen and Jonas Wendel and to Christian Danielson and to Eva on behalf of Jonas Ekeberg, for their vision and for their insights. I would like to offer congratulations to everyone involved in the arrangements for today's Nordic Cultural Summit, and thank you for inviting me to share an update on Nordic Bridges 2022, the cultural initiative that Harbourfront Centre has had the privilege of curating and lead producing this year. What follows will, I hope, shine a light on the bridges that have been built and continue to be built between Nordic and Canadian artists and art organisations, and we're extremely grateful to the Nordic Council of Ministers for their support, as well as the many cultural funders, foundations and sponsors who have come on board to support this year-long initiative. I arrived in Canada from Sydney in 2014, already appreciating the Nordic region as a leader in cultural cooperation in a global context, and already very familiar with the Nordic region's commitment to its artists and its cultural institutions. The Biennale of Sydney in Australia, where I worked prior to Harbourfront, has a long history of working with OCA as a recipient of many grants that significantly enriched each exhibition, and often transformed the lives of professional artists, professional lives of Nordic artists, who were supported to travel to Sydney and exhibit alongside other artists from all over the world, and who forged long-term collaborations and connections with international museums, curators, gallerists, collectors, audiences, and importantly, fellow artists. Harbourfront Centre, as some of you may know, is an international centre for contemporary arts, culture and ideas. We operate on a 10-acre campus on Toronto's central waterfront, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat peoples, covered by Treaty 13 of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We have 3 soft-seat theatres, an 1,100-seat outdoor concert stage, 2 galleries and 5 working craft and design studios, providing 25 craft artists residencies for between 1 and 3 years. We're also home for the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery and the Toronto International Festival of Authors. Throughout its almost 50-year history, Harbourfront has been a critical part of the national cultural landscape. We inspire audiences and visitors with a breadth of ambitious and engaging experiences, and we champion contemporary Canadian artists throughout their careers, presenting them alongside international artists and fostering national and international artistic exchange between disciplines and between cultures. Importantly, we're a multidisciplinary institution, so our impact in the Canadian cultural sector is broad. And incidentally, and I think not enough arts institutions actually acknowledge this, we're also a training ground for many arts professionals in Toronto and even in Canada, as our alumni work in various parts of the country. Harbourfront Centre is also the training ground and launchpad for many artists, and we're very proud to have led and produced this Nordic Bridges initiative. It's been 4 years since Harbourfront Centre was invited by the Nordic embassies in Ottawa to apply to the Nordic Council of Ministers, and we were honoured to be chosen from over 20 other cities and countries around the world. Since that time, as has been mentioned, we had to delay the initiative by an entire year and have deferred, postponed and cancelled various events within the initiative as we all navigated the global pandemic and everyone's health and well-being. These delays, while not planned, afforded Harbourfront Centre, our 20 program partners across the country and the artists being presented to actually deepen and cultivate their relationships and allowed the work that was presented more time to ripen, if I can put a positive spin on some of the hurdles that we actually faced. Nordic Bridges is many things. It's about cultural exchange, about international collaboration and critical conversations, about cultural diplomacy, and about ways in which we can, through cultural exchange and sharing ideas within a global context, affect change. And ultimately, it is about legacy, the relationships that have been forged, the new work that has been created, the strong ties that will continue to bridge our cultures well beyond 2022. What has made Nordic Bridges so unique from previous cultural initiatives is that it has been national in scope, in addition to being a year-long undertaking, rather than a shorter festival format, which many might say was very ambitious. And we adopted this approach with the intention of forging meaningful and sustained engagement between Canada and the Nordic region. And now that we've reached this final month of the programming, we can emphatically report that we have succeeded in this goal. In a country as geographically vast as Canada, it was important to us at Harbourfront Centre and as a leading cultural Canadian institution that we invite national programming partners to the table. And this opened the door to a variety of collaborations that took the focus from coast to coast to coast. It also created new opportunities, for example, the chance to build out tours for participating artists wherever possible, giving artists and their work opportunities to deepen their engagement with audiences and presenters from more than one city in Canada. So artists like the Sami Joik-Vilda performed 15 concerts across Canada in a 3-week music tour this past summer, which took them from Quebec to Ontario to Alberta and then to British Columbia. And they received an original commission from Harbourfront Centre for a brand new work that premiered as part of our Summer Music in the Garden series in Toronto's Music Garden. Winter guests from Norway presented their contemporary work Story Story Die in Toronto at Harbourfront Centre, in Ottawa at the National Arts Centre, in Montreal at Dance Dance, and in Vancouver at Dance House. And Spoing by Kit Johnson X-Act from Denmark presented their work at our Junior Festival and not only engaged with many families and young children about the environment and garbage, but won a 2020 Dora Maver Award, which are Toronto's major theatre awards. As a reminder, the programming pillars that informed, actually maybe not as a reminder, maybe letting you all know, the programming pillars that informed the curation of Nordic Bridges are artistic innovation, accessibility and inclusion, Indigenous perspectives, and resilience and sustainability. And these pillars came out of not only Harbourfront Centre's strategic plan, but also our shared values with the Nordic region and Canada's shared values with the Nordic region. They're also very important and current conversations with our cultural colleagues, and that these conversations are being had across both Canada and the Nordic region. From the outset, Harbourfront has been committed to the idea that Nordic Bridges would be about quality of cultural exploration and of investing in meaningful experiences. And for example, we invited the Finnish visual artist and disability activist Jenni-Julia Wallenheimo-Heimonen to Harbourfront Centre for a 3-month visual artist residency, and we took a third of our gallery space and created a working studio for her, and the rest was a public exhibition space for her work, and she gave tours and workshops and engaged in panel conversations and inspired up-and-coming artists. We are very grateful for the seeds she planted here. And just recently she posted on her Instagram, when she was talking about a strong review of her work at Helsinki Museum in a group exhibition. I would also like to thank Nordic Bridges Artist Residency at Harbourfront Centre in Toronto for the opportunity to spend 3 months thinking about space and disability issues from a new perspective. Without that period away from home, without amazing artists I met and big world influences, this work would have turned out differently. And really that's sort of the testimony that we really hope that many of the artists who participated in Nordic Bridges will be able to make when they reflect on the past year's activities. Toronto's creative collective Artspin, who with Nordic Bridges support is bringing Nordic Sonoculture to Canada, has forged partnerships with so many Nordic artists that they will actually be heading to a future Arctic Action Festival in Svalbard and bringing the work of Nordic artists to Canada through their Public Sweat initiative in 2023. One of our collaborative performing arts exchanges invited leading deaf theatre artists from Sweden to mentor the core creative team of Inside Out Theatre in Alberta and Renaissance Opera in British Columbia in the creation of a new deaf opera work in progress. They had a beautiful workshop earlier this year and will go on to stage the full opera in 2024. The Sphere Festival at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa this past September presented the second iteration of Arctic Imagination in collaboration with the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen. This iteration saw Canadian and Nordic scientists discussing the climate crisis and the importance of both perspectives, art and science, working together to effect change. It was very successful, and we're now in discussions to potentially broaden this conversation into 2023 and 2024, working with the Royal Danish Library and our partners at the Nordic embassies in Ottawa. We're now beginning to survey our program partners and participating artists about their experience, and there are a few additional notable moments that I wanted to share out of the many that we've received so far from participating artists. So visual artists Randy Samsonson of the Faroe Islands and Justine Woods, who's based in Toronto, collaborated on the Shared Train exhibition for our partner program Design TO earlier in the year. And despite it being a digital connection due to the pandemic, they both speak highly of the bond that they have created, one that Justine has referred to as everlasting. And these are sort of connections that I referred to at the beginning of the year that we were really hoping would come out of this initiative. There was also immense joy reported from the Yukon Territory at the Yukon Arts Centre after extending the run of the only Canadian stop for Arctic highways, a collaborative Indigenous-led touring visual arts exhibition. The relationships that will continue as Sami artist and curator Thomas Kolbengtsson and Yukon Arts Director of Visual Arts Mary Bradshaw plan for a future collaboration in 2023. Half of the Sami curatorial team was able to travel to the Arctic city for the opening, which was a first for many of them. May 19 and 20 remain a highlight of the year-long initiative when we welcomed many of our Nordic colleagues, including the chair and the Nordic Council of Ministers, the Minister, and so many from the Nordic Council and various arts councils and cultural contacts to Toronto. And the evening, which featured a dinner prepared through a chef's collaboration between Klaus Meyer and chef Annika Madsen from Fassengarden in Copenhagen, and Toronto chef Tobin, and a showcase of performances in addition to the important cultural diplomatic meetings held with Canadian Heritage and Global Affairs, reinforce what we know, which is that culture and cultural diplomacy is critical to the well-being of a democratic society and important in building and maintaining the ever-important global bridges between our nations. To date, we have produced collectively more than 1,300 days of programming, with more than 80% of the events being free of charge to the public to enjoy. And in fact, as part of our Key Change commitment, which is an initiative ensuring gender parity in programming, which Oslo World Festival is a lead on, 52% of the artists presented on our stages have been female. I also want to mention that alongside Nordic Bridges, Harbourfront Centre has also produced 2 additional initiatives that are nested inside Nordic Bridges, Nordic Talks and the Nordic Canadian Fellowship for Environmental Journalism. The Nordic Talks have allowed us to continuously engage with the public on important topics of the future of disability, the future of art and activism, the future of Black youth on a global stage, to name a few. And the Environmental Journalism Fellowship has been an important way to engage youth, an opportunity for aspiring journalists between the ages of 18 and 25 from the Nordic region and from Canada, who care deeply about the environment, about sustainability and about truth, to come together in partnership and pursue a deep dive reporting trip on an urgent climate crisis topic. Among the collaborations, Andrea Creed from Norway partnered with Eric Nygaard from Toronto and reported on the issues and possible solutions of the fast fashion industry. Their work will be part of an exhibition running at Harbourfront from December 8th to January the 8th, 2023. The fellows had 2 boot camps, travelled to Tromsø in the Arctic and went on their reporting trips. They have now submitted their reports, which we're currently in the process of preparing for the exhibition and compiling into a book that will be shared as part of the final report of the initiative. And these young journalists have forged lifelong relationships across the ocean and are so grateful for this unique opportunity. And in fact, we keep being asked if the initiative will continue into the future. So one of the most important questions that we're asking ourselves is, how do we keep this momentum going? How do we make new pathways for more Nordic artists to continue to collaborate with Canadian artists and art organisations? And how do we reinforce the bridge that has been built and ensure that it flows both ways? We know that some groundwork has been laid. Our program partners across Canada have forged strong relationships with each of the Nordic embassies in Ottawa. Our colleagues at the embassies have, in turn, shared that this initiative has brought them all closer together and working as Nordics, which is a lovely byproduct of our collaboration. And despite the many challenges of producing a multinational, multidisciplinary year-long project during a global pandemic, hundreds of artists from across Canada and across the Nordic region, with the support of Nordic Bridges, we premiered and created new works and toured to new cities, and the artists have made long and deep relationships with one another. So in closing, I extend a warm invitation to you all to join us for the closing of the year-long program with our Festival of Cool. The Nordic Bridges programming at Harbourfront Centre in this particular festival will feature the final Nordic talk entitled The Future Is Now, which will discuss society's role in the next 7 years in relation to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. Norway's ambassador to Canada, Jon Fredriksson, will be one of the panellists. And we're also going to present a Nordic music double bill featuring Finland's Tuulatar and the Nordic sextet Vik, hailing from Norway, Sweden and Denmark, in addition to the Ontario premiere of a striking theatrical adaptation of Melville's Moby Dick from award-winning French-Norwegian puppetry company Plexus Polaire. And finally, we are presenting the North American premiere of Post-Capitalistic Auction by China-born Norwegian-based artist Jinyi Wang. Post-Capitalistic Auction is a real yet alternative auction that invites a reflection on art and value, crossing over performance, contemporary art and social investigation, an auction where bidders are invited to bid for artworks in new ways. For this auction, money is not the only available currency to purchase art, and understanding, opportunity and exchange are also acceptable currencies. As bids are made, it is the artist who decides the successful bid to purchase their artwork, and during the bidding process, a panel of advisors will offer different perspectives on the bids. The auction will include a work by artists Caroline Hyath of Norway and Rita Ikonen of Finland. So even in the final days of this year-long program, the initiative continues to pose very important questions about the world that we live in and the value of art, the value of empathy and of exchanging one for the other. So thank you very much for your time today and for your support of Nordic Bridges. Thanks.
Thank you, Mara Bray. The
Northern Artists Gathering in Gothenburg in 1882 was a very important milestone in the Northern Artistic Operation. Also, the royals were present, but the Swedish king, Oscar II, considered himself as one of the artists, not as a manager. This impacted the development of the Nordic artistic discourse since the 70s, when Christian Fredrik intervened in mythology clash in Copenhagen. The king, Oscar, had to leave Gothenburg's meeting because of a cold. But the meeting ended with an agreement between the Nordic artists, or 3 agreements that was the beginning of a new Northern artistic institution. It was not formed on the court's conditions as the artistic academies were, like in Copenhagen, but they were based on the initiatives from artists themselves. First, they asked the northern governments to reinforce the artistic purchases from the neighboring countries and to strengthen the transport with the railway and meet every 3rd year. My colleague from the Artists Council Norway, Markus Zachrisson, will take over as for the discussion. He's the Director of Research and Analysis, but I would like to present first the panelists that were one of the important contributors during the pandemic. First, I would like to welcome Maria Hevies, is the Center for Policy Research in Helsinki, and then Jenny Johannesson from Culture Analysis in in Stockholm, and Håkon Bekkeleben from Arts Council Norway here in Oslo. Please first take a stand, and then Marcus will come and lead a conversation. Thank you. Thank you, Jonas. Thank you for the invitation. I am going to tell you about a study that we have presented in Helsingfors on the task from the Nordic Council Ministers. This is changes in the northern cultures in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. I have worked with a team with Anne-Sophie Blomström. I would go shortly through what we have done. This is a basis for the report that will be presented on 15th of March. So now we're in the middle of the last work. So this was based on the needs and on development of the cultural sector. And the most important thing was what were the adjustments were made during the pandemic, and what is the what we're going to present. This is a cooperation between the northern countries under these three areas. As I mentioned, there is a world out there, and there are events that influence our research. We have different background structures, even though we consider ourselves very alike, but our geography and economy are different. We have different ways of handling crises, like COVID, and like energy crisis, and wars, and energy crisis, and climate, and everything. So all this has a collective impact on the cultural life. When we take what has happened in Sweden, maybe Denmark is not very interesting, but Finland was also participating in April. It is also is going on some internal discussions. There are also things happening. We have passed COVID, but maybe not as far as we wanted or would hope to. We have still some research to do, and we have to concentrate on different targets. And we have three different targets in our research project. First block is this. So overview of the structure of the cultural sector, and the tendencies at autonomous regions. And the tendencies are that we have different similarities in our culture policies models, and we focus on that. We have differences with the cultural regimes. We have different parts of this collective fellowship when it comes to framework, legal framework, and also we have, for example, a Minister of Culture in Norway and in Iceland, and so these political regimes look different in different countries. We have also different situations when it comes to economical situation. It also has an impact on our situation, but cultural policies, how do resources are applied, and so on. We have also different tendencies. How do we reinforce creative industries in different ways? And also we have seen what digitalization can lead to, what kind of economic effects can occur. The second part, or second block, is the first. Well, I have started with one. Okay, this is what I have said and what I'm going to say. And are there visible changes and achievement of goals? When we are looking at 2022, we do observe differences between 21 and 22, but there are not very identified variables, and they're not very strict differences. We have, of course, different parts of, but not additional. All these systems are support system have been finished. When we are also discussing what has really happened and who got support or grant or who fell between the chairs. So this discussion is going to go on. And what is visible here is vulnerability in this field, both on in the terms of labor market and for the practitioners in the cultural field. All this demonstrates a certain vulnerability, and it becomes a part of our political discussion. So what can we present when we are going to have present the reports? For example, in Finland, they have suggested some variables for the next period of reporting, but in some countries there are cultures are free, but at the same on other countries we have some rigid systems of directing. So it's very interesting and combination. And the third block is how the cultural sector changed after the pandemic, and we know that the ratio of work involvement is very high, but not everyone is employed. We don't have unemployed. We just artists. We have artists without income. So there is a question of work, of providing income, and the whole sector is also has made visible many cases in terms of economy. There are many industries and participants and stakeholders that also have needed support, even though they were placing themselves beyond this system, and they have become more visible. And all these there are some economical uneasiness with inflation, with all this bank loan. You can have the
to prioritize. So perhaps it's quite difficult. It's natural that people perhaps do not give priority to culture, given that they have other financial issues. We also need to look at the question that there's been a shift into digital culture, and that people tend to leave their homes less to enjoy culture. Instead, people tend to stay at home and listen to music. That's now become the new way of enjoying culture. So there are many different trends moving at the same time. So to summarize, have the arts recovered in their respective countries / autonomous regions? No. I'm sure we can discuss more about this as we proceed, but when the report is ready. But let me move on to ask, what do we need to know more about? Well, among other things, the changes in cultural habits. What do people give priority to? What do people prefer to enjoy? Do people go to the cinema, to the theatre? Do they go to the library? Do they go to the museum? Or what do people do now? There's been a lot of discussion about the fact that people now give priority, or rather people give much more priority. People might be willing to go to a concert with a specific artist or musician, but then that is considered an investment that people are willing to spend money on. But quite simply, to put it in simple words, cultural habits have changed. Next, we need to find out more about the interaction between different cultural economics. The cultural economics have changed. It is partly funded by private individuals and partly by the state. But there are also other types of cultural economics that one hasn't really looked at enough yet. We haven't really looked enough at the public efforts made in that regard. And then we have the impact on cultural policy of digitalization. It's often considered to be free. Digital products are often considered to be free. People often think they don't cost anything. Some services one does have to pay for, but others not. So there are some types of cultural activities that are digitized and others are not. Others are marketed nationally, others are marketed internationally. I've learned a lot about Web 3 or Web 3, which says something about accessing different types of networks and structures. So this is partly about the structures of national policy, but now we're talking about boundary crossing cultural policy consequences. Oh dear, I only have 5 seconds left. What am I going to do with those? I would like to thank you so much for your attention. Please do contact me if you would like to find out anything more. You know where to find me. Well, I think I'll take the floor. And I understood that I'm expected to click on this all by myself. Right. My name is Jenny Johannessen. I present Kulturanalyse Norden, which is we undertake assignment research for the Nordic authorities about cultural policy. And that is why I was asked to provide an insight into the Swedish summary of the situation. How things are going in Sweden. That's what I've been asked to speak about. And of course, this analysis is built on the study that we've done looking at the consequences of the pandemic. And here it's important for me to highlight that this analysis and these statistics, they only go to 2021. So all of those are involved in working on the production of knowledge. We agree, we're all in agreement that the really interesting figures are yet to be published. So we haven't got to the really interesting bit. But having said that, certainly from a Swedish perspective, we were asked to look at an assessment of the recovery after the pandemic. But there's a general agreement that the pandemic has highlighted structural problems in Swedish cultural policy. And from the point of cultural analysis, this is primarily about the national cultural policy targets or objectives. Everybody wants art and to be free, and you want everybody to be involved in art and culture, and that this should be an important force for identity and sense of community. So we summarized what the pandemic's impact signified for Sweden, and we did this relative to the publicly defined objectives. But it must be said that the pandemic has had a highly negative, very significant negative impact on the arts generally. But it must be said that the impact has been very uneven. Everybody has been affected, but the private players and the idealistic or philanthropic players have been hit the hardest. So the statistics published in July by the authorities, there we could show that in November 2021, the employment figures had gone back to the level that they were before the pandemic. But regarding those who had their own businesses and also those that are involved in combined activities, so those that are freelancers but also are partly employed, this group had a slower recovery. In fact, we can't even be quite so certain that there was a recovery for these people who had a sort of type of split employment. And this expresses very clearly the second point, which is that there are inadequate social and cultural conditions for the arts. And this problem, of course, predates the pandemic. It has become clearer after the pandemic. And part of the problem here that we see is that the players in the art sector, the artists, they work partly as artists, but they also have other jobs on top. So there have been a number of assessments to assess the impact of Swedish policy. A number of studies and analysis and reports have been done. So we do see that there are a number of proposals that can be implemented to improve how these artists fare. And most importantly, it's important to provide a greater sense of security and welfare for these artists. If anything has been positive, is that perhaps there's a great understanding now how people in the arts business can provide for themselves. Perhaps there's a clearer understanding of this now. as we look forward to a lot of what we need to be concerned about, it concerns general societal challenges, food crisis, inflation, financial crisis. But we know that in Sweden, the municipalities and local governments, they were struggling also before the pandemic. With the demographic changes and more elderly people relative to young people. So these trends predate the pandemic, and then you have the pandemic on top of that. All of this has really made it very clear that there are basic fundamental anomalies and inadequacies in the provision of services for people in the arts. So now we would like to show, thirdly, that the differences between the people involved or who participate in the arts continue to reflect geographical and socioeconomic differences. We see that the people who attend most cultural activities are mature, highly educated, and well-off women, rather than everybody else. So we must conclude that there is not enough infrastructure in civic society to support the arts. So ultimately it is the individual players that are important for variety and diversity in the arts. They are hugely important if the arts are to flourish. And they are, so we need more of an infrastructure to ensure that anybody can work at the arts, and also anybody can enjoy the arts. But we must, on the basis of this, conclude that the infrastructure is highly vulnerable, especially, of course, in the rural districts. I must say, in the countryside, there are very few cultural players, primarily study organizations and libraries, to be honest. Even though, so it has been our job to study the hindrances and obstacles to free cultural enjoyment of cultural activities. So I will now give the floor to Håkon. Please, Håkon, go ahead.
Thank you. How did pandemic impact cultural life in Norway? Together with Norwegian Film Institute, we have developed 12 reports that I will summarize in 5 minutes. It's not an easy task, but I will make a try. During the pandemic, our cultural life in Norway was the part that was the most hardly stricken. It led not only to the economic losses, but also to the society's loss of culture as a collective experience of fellowship around art, and also some lost their revenues, their income. So I would like to present the bigger picture of their lost activity. This is a national counting. What are the biggest economic consequences in different parts of this sector? They are all different also in Norway. The publicly financed institutions, for example, they have lost a lot of visitors, but had also lower costs. They had state grants, and it ended with a stable result. Artists earned less on their artistic work, but all other income has kept them stable. Like, for example, musicians and stage artists, they had also a total loss of revenues. The companies bigger companies have lost a decisive amount of revenues, but also lost in their costs, and their all-around result was quite stable. What we do not know a lot about those smaller companies and medium companies, we did not have data about them, but it was a relatively small share of state support went to those smaller companies. About 6 billion kroner went to the crisis support of the so-called compensation and stimulation grants, and the major part of that went to the bigger actors, bigger recipients. What about the word of employment? Employment went up from 84,000 to 88,000 in 2021. It wasn't a positive result, but the employment number in cultural sector was also changed and shifted. Well, self-employment have increased. Well, we're going to go back to that slide. Well, this sector has also found new ways of working. The biggest audiences arenas disappeared, and international activity died. But there were different ways of cooperation, and a digital leap took place. Digital possibilities were taken, and the actors learned a lot about digital forms, and with competencies and market knowledge and rights, just to mention something. And our research shows that there was certain, digital habit development. So we have something to develop here. This curve looks sad, but when it comes to physical culture has declined in 21, and in 2016 60% visited concerts, and it was 20% less in 21, and a cinema visit went from 70 to 20%, and so on. At the same time, the digital offer became more important in our survey. 35% use our digital offer during the pandemic. 1 of 4 used digital offers more often than ever. And what about target group children and youth? 2 years is a long period in a child's life, and some of them lost experience with arts, and it may have consequences for this generation that has not come to light yet. In the end, the pandemic hindered our ambitions in cultural policies, so to make culture and art available for everyone, to make it visible, and to create workplaces and economical values. A bigger question is, what long-term consequences does this pandemic have? The question is complicated, and when the cultural life is reduced in both costs and values. So it will be an exciting process to follow, to see what happens to the institutions and audience when we may face a new crisis. Thank you. Very well, it worked well. Håkon should summarize 12 reports for 5 minutes, and now we're going to have to summarize the all knowledge across the Nordic countries for 20 minutes. These 3 people have worked with how to develop the cultural policies in northern countries. So as you have heard about these institutions, there are some joint or common values or characteristics, and this is what we are going to underline here. So we have a list of questions that we're going to discuss, and we are going to continue our discussion after this digital format as well. But the topic is how are we connected to the digital market, how it has been changed. You have already said something, and would you tell more, Håkon? What do you see in Norway? One thing is what happens to artists' income and how are they interconnected with a working life. I don't know the details, but when you collect income from other places, so this combining economy, we do not have this fixed positions and social rights as other employees in the working life. There is an increase in this amount of this self-employed, like single person companies. So they have a very loose connection to the labor market. It would be very interesting to follow up on that.
understand that the tendencies are quite similar in Sweden. Yes, based on what Håkon said, there are many parallels to what's going on in Sweden. What I would like to remind people of here today is the role of civic society in the non-profit government, because a lot of this is about career development, educational pathways. In order to become employed, we're talking about the folk high schools, which again is a common feature in the Nordic countries that doesn't exist in other countries. But we talked about the role of civic society in commissioning our cultural activities. And certainly in my organization, the Kulturanalyst Nordic, we work a lot on statistics, gathering data so that we can provide information about what's actually happening in the arts field. And civic society is an area where it's particularly difficult in all of the Nordic countries, because these players, they're working on a non-profit basis, on an idealistic basis. So they perhaps don't spend that amount of time in documenting their own activities. So here, to be honest, we have a knowledge gap when it comes to civic society. Perhaps we call things differently in the different Nordic countries, but it's basically the same thing. And it is important, this cultural activities are also an important part of the employment market. In my previous life, I was a researcher on the Nordic welfare model, and my conclusion was actually that there were 5 different welfare models. And this is kind of what you're saying. You're saying that there are parallels between the different cultural sectors, but yet there are national differences between the various countries. Well, we did look at this very carefully, what you said there. But if you look at the cultural sector's role in the general economics, of course, the cultural sector has a very unusual structure, really, because it's partly privately funded, partly idealistically funded, partly funded by the government. And there are huge differences between these 5 countries. You've got the national traditions, and yet there is the underlying Nordic tradition. There are common traits. What we do have in common is that we have artists or culture creators, but I like to call them artists, to be honest. And perhaps we expect that they should produce a lot of new things, that we expect them to drive the process. They're meant to be the avant-garde people, the ones who show the pathway. But at the same time, we expect them to follow their call. We expect them to be deeply committed and engaged in their work. We don't want them to be like the rest of us. We don't expect them to fall ill like the rest of us do. We don't necessarily expect them to spend time with their families. We want them to really follow their call and build art. So, but we need for them to be members in our welfare society as well. We want there to be space for art in our welfare society, and yet welfare society doesn't really provide space for these artists. So this is an interesting anomaly. Certainly in the studies of Norway, there's been you've studied the artist income, haven't you? Can you tell us more about this Norwegian study? Yes, artist income is interesting, and I really liked what you said there about what the expectation is that artists should contribute to society at large. Artists as a group tend to have quite low income, but they tend to have high education, as you're pointing out there on my side. So if you correlate the income to education, I'm afraid artists do not score very highly. They tend to have very low incomes relative to their education. I don't want to reveal all of the goodies of the research about to be published, but in the report that we are now working on, the researchers look at how Norwegian artists are situated relative to the low income limit, the poverty threshold. I would guess that about a third of the artists are actually below the low income threshold. And yet we expect them to produce lots of useful things for society. Is that what you're saying, that expectation continues? Yes, very much so, at the risk of repeating myself, but it is very interesting that the artists have to gain an income from other parts of their lives. And this, of course, leads to them spending less time on producing art, and they have to spend more time on earning the money, putting the bread and butter on the table. So in that sense, the artists are not allowed to spend enough time on their core activities. And do you recognize that what he's saying there about artists having to rely on different sorts of income and generating different types of income? perhaps that, I don't know, have to do shifts at the local shop and man the till in order to have a sufficient income. Have you looked at that? Well, of course, we've looked at the situation in Sweden, the national situation. There is a research anthology on the research from the different Nordic countries where the funding models in the respective countries is described. And this, of course, is something that a lot of the Nordic countries have in common. There is a deep faith and expectation that the government should pick up the slack and help these people, because in different ways the decision has been made that we want to have these artists and we want everybody to participate and contribute. So the funding structures in the different countries look different. For instance, Finland gives more emphasis to funding foundations in Finland than we do in Sweden. Then you have the lottery, which also offers some funds to some artistic activities. And in Sweden, for us, it's a problem that we don't know enough about public funding for the cultural sector. And in the lack of this knowledge, it's quite difficult for the government to come with any clear recommendations on how the funding should be framed. Not least, it's a question of how should the funding be designed and at the same time safeguard certain cultural policy objectives. Because it's a question of what does one actually want to achieve with that money. I'd like to pick up there. There's been a lot of reporting on the creative business's significance for society at large, and this was also visible during the pandemic. And it has emerged that there's very little cooperation between the different ministries. In fact, Iceland is perhaps the leading player here because they have a minister both for the arts and trade and industry. Perhaps we need the government to take more of a holistic perspective on these issues. So that we can have more of an idea where does this money go and where does the money flow, because it doesn't disappear. While working specifically on the cultural sector, one also needs to work in a more holistic way and integrate one's work on the cultural sector with the other sectors in the economy. What we have seen in the schemes that were managed by the Arts Council of Norway, we saw that there were many of the people who applied for funding. They had not been in contact with the Arts Council of Norway in the previous 5 years, so we basically were able to uncover a large surrounding area that we weren't really aware of. We hadn't been in contact with them before the pandemic. They were there all along, but we didn't know enough about them until the pandemic came and they applied for funds. And this is something that we should definitely put on our agenda going forward. One of the big advantages of being a Nordic country is that we always have relevant countries with which we can compare ourselves. We can always look over the border and see, oh, what's the neighbour doing? Oh, we can always see, oh, well, if the other neighbours are doing it, maybe it's a good idea. Maybe we should be doing it too. And if we see that nobody else is doing it, sometimes we think, oh, no, this is probably a bad idea. You have studied the Nordic countries overall. And now, I suppose, based on your work, we can benchmark the countries. Can we see who is top of the class? Well, perhaps that's the wrong expression. We don't like rankings in the Nordics, as you know. But if we apply this helicopter perspective to the Nordics, I don't want you to tell me who's top of the class, but nevertheless, could you offer some reflections on what should we be doing more of and what should we be doing less on? Oh, that is a difficult question. I wouldn't want to out anybody. Don't want to make anybody look bad. Oh, God, oh, God. Well, everybody does the things just a little bit differently, in Finland, we do things one way. In Sweden, they might say, oh, look, we've got so much above zero, and the Finnish say, oh, we're so much below zero. And then, one can say, well, perhaps the Swedes have a very economic perspective on their activities. Well, for all the countries, the libraries are the #1 cultural player. And then there's a lot of focus on theatre and music. But in Finland, I must be saying the performing arts are actually doing the poorest, as in the other Nordic countries. So perhaps we need more of an assessment on the visual arts specifically. It's interesting that the 2 pandemic years could perhaps be definitive for a whole generation. I mean, this is exciting stuff. You know, we see the people who might be going for different activities. I don't know who is top of the class. I don't know. I would like to say Finland, but I don't suppose I could say that. No, I can't do that sort of. And the Norwegians, they have all that oil, so they don't count anyway. And the Swedes, you know, they don't even know what the Swedish cultural canon should be. Well, you know, we have all these generalizations. There are some tendencies, but everybody does a little bit of their own thing. I can feel the temperature of the debate rising. Is this where I should be saying something pro-Norwegian, he asks? Well, it's interesting to note that in terms of cultural policy, the pandemic situation was new for all European countries. And it very much bore the hallmark that for the first time one had to really look at the money. It must be said that the industries were offered a very large funding schemes in connection with the pandemic. And that's very interesting because it gives us an opportunity to quantify this financially in retrospect. And perhaps we haven't had that financial focus in the Nordics so far. So instead of looking at where the money goes, well, that's an interesting perspective to look at where the money went. Perhaps going forward, it's more important to look at what did we learn from the pandemic that may perhaps come in useful now. That may come in useful now in these very uncertain times that we're looking at now. From a Swedish perspective, you know, one thing that the Swedes are really good at are reports and studies. Swedes are really good at doing reports. It's not just that we do that a lot in Sweden, but my organization, the Kulturanalys Norden, we are gathering more data. We want to do more studies, more inquiries, basically just undertake more analysis so that we can, you know, we really want to be able to answer your question, but it would take more studies. As yet, we don't have the data. This question of harmonizing the statistics, you know, in Gothenburg, there's a whole group sitting there only working on statistics. But we need to contextualize the data in order to conduct a proper analysis. Just the numbers isn't enough. We need to contextualize things. And that's what I wanted to say. The information and the expectations we have of the cultural sector. You know, we heard about this already. We heard about transformation, adaptation. I mean, the artists then know how to do this. They're good at this. All the expectations that we have to the cultural sector, the culture is expected to contribute to well-being, to mental health, to sustainability. But all of this, of course, requires investment in culture. You can't have all of these benefits without actually investing in the cultural sector. If we don't invest, we are looking at a downward spiral where people might stop consuming art. You know, people might start scrimping and saving on their cultural activities. You know, if we see that, then we're left with very little culture. And in Norway, I think there's a sign that there's a much reduced utilization of culture, and we're hoping that will rise again, don't we? Well, you know, very often we say, oh, yeah, we'd like to know more about that, but we're actually lacking the data. So hopefully in 2023, we'll be able to tell you more, because then we'll have more data. But the use of cultural activities, this is really where culture is put to use for society, where society ends up benefiting from culture, among other things, because culture promotes a democratic dialogue. So we need to have more focus on funding these cultural activities. And then we need to look at where is this culture consumed or used. Would you like to say something about the other countries as well? We've worked a lot on analyzing the impact and the effect of the cultural activities, but we need to define more what criteria one wants to be met. You know, what is it one wants from the cultural activities? If we're going to analyze it, we need to look more at the objectives. But we can really only answer your questions if we conduct those analyses. We have a lot of reports also from the Norwegian institutions, especially most recently in the area of the dramatic arts. So we find yet again a confirmation that there were 30% fewer performances in 2021 than in 2019. There were 60% fewer people in the audience in 2021. But having said that, the dramatic arts were able to reach 94% of the citizens of Sweden, especially the children and young people. So must be said that there is a gradual recovery in terms of participation, but no, we have not yet made a full recovery. We're not yet at the pre-pandemic situation. And then there's the question of digitalization. This is an important question. Certainly in Sweden, we have started to question and analyze more the question of digitization of culture. It would have been lovely if we'd done this before the pandemic, because then we might have been better prepared for the pandemic. Will the digital culture provision, will that come on top of the cultural activities, or will it change the way that we enjoy culture? What do you think? I guess it is quite problematic that this has only just entered the statistics. It should have been in the statistics earlier. We would have liked to know about this earlier. There were many private institutions that have measured the use of cultural activities recently, and they too find that the use of digital culture has exploded, really. It's risen a lot, especially among the younger parts of the population. But the question of habits, that is something we don't know enough about yet, and we don't really know about how this is going to play out in the long picture. Certainly on the basis of anecdotal evidence, we do now have more and more reports, especially from the municipalities, especially from the local governments, telling us that there are not many people attending events in the local art centres. You know, if the stars go out into the countryside and have performances locally, they do draw crowds. But not as much as before. So the local event organizers are finding that it is more difficult to draw crowds than it was before the pandemic. So truly, behavior appears to have changed. And this is something we need to look more into and find more out about. If we can't say anything definite just yet. You know, we've tried to look into the crystal ball and look at what's going to happen in the future, but it's not easy to ask people what they're going to do. We have 52 seconds left, says the moderator. Maria, you summarized that we need to learn more about cultural habits. We need to learn more about the interaction between different cultural economics, and we need to learn more about the impact of digitization for cultural activities. And those of us who work on knowledge production, we think, what do we know? What do we not know? And what is it we should know? So now you get 15 seconds each. Do you agree with what Maria says, or would you like to add something or subtract something? Well, now that we're here, there's something else I'd like to highlight. Now that we're here to talk about cooperation, it is important to continue monitoring and continue to analyze these developments. We have just today, actually, my organization has published a pilot study or a pre-study where we want to focus more on analyzing the need to further intensify the work for Nordic collaboration. I'm sorry, I used up too much time. Apologies. I would certainly like to say that the international collaboration in the field of culture has been very much affected by the pandemic, and it will take time to build us up again. And this has also affected the Sami collaboration, which by its very nature is international and cross-boundary collaboration. That too has been affected, and we need to work to let this recover. Thank you so much. We are now 20 seconds behind schedule. But there's nothing new that we speak too much. Thank you so much for your attention.
Now it's a break. 20 minutes long. Well, welcome back. We have proved that disapproved that the researchers are boring. Well, after the reconstruction of the welfare state in Norway after the World War, uh, the artists involved in institutionalization of the artistic work, and they have established a new pavilion in Venice, and in 1966 there were the first exhibition with the first Nordic funds, and Nordic Artistic Center in 1978 was a coping stone of the Nordic operation that was begun in the Gothenburg 100 years before, and it was transformed in the Nordic Institute of Contemporary Art. Fantastic. I pronounce it in English, and even the word contemporary. And after that, this historical work through this last and very important institute exhibition, Rethinking Nordic Colonialism, in Finland, in Greenland, and in Finnish Sapmi, Faroe Islands. So Norway is more than only 5 countries, and our histories are not synonymous with the Scandinavian royal house's contribution, even though I have mentioned them already. My joy is to present Christian Danielsen back on the stage, who will lead a discussion on cultural challenges, needs, and in the wake of the pandemic. Thank you for all the looks back on the Nordic operation. I have got 42 minutes and 57 seconds together with the panel. Will be even more exciting than the researchers themselves. We have already got a lot of information about the pandemic stroke, the cultural sector, what we know today, and what we also will learn about 23, 24, and the years to come. But knowledge itself is not sufficient. It has to be made to instruments and maybe grants and support schemes. I have now brought with me 5 persons in the panel that represent the Nordic cultural bureaucracy and the Sami Council and the Nordic House in Reykjavik. First, Kristina Hetta from Sami Council, head of cultural unit. Then Sabina Westerholm, director of Nordic House in Reykjavik. Kai Sarabin, the director general at the Swedish Arts Council. There are some differences, states council, my counterpart in Sweden. Benny Marcel, the director of the Nordic Culture Fund. And Paula Tovinen, the director of Arts Promotion Center in Finland. Taika. During our conversation, we will also speak English in some parts. Okay, everyone will understand, no worries. And so, this was just my thoughts expressed, a lot of going on in my head. So, dilemmas. Cultural policies consist of very many dilemmas. We have heard about, there are no boundaries for how many intentions in cultural policies. We can't succeed in everything, and we don't have funds for every ambition we have produced. And then what we have left is dilemma. The first one, the pandemic's consequences. We have already mentioned it, but in the cultural life in Norway, what surprised us was how easy it was to close down the whole cultural sector in Norway. And just to give you some figures, well, the turnover is 50 million, and we have the big amounts, and we can make our calculations over the whole Nordic countries. And so it took time before we opened itself. And of course, it was a bit intervention. And the question is, how can we close our meeting points for culture and hold on for 2 years where libraries, exhibitions and shows were closed down? So my first question will be, first maybe to the cultural councils. So our cultural policy has to be represented through our. Has the cultural policy become less important, and what can we do that? From the Swedish perspective, of course, we are feeling 50 years old this year, and it has changed, but not that much that when we look back 50 years. And now we have this State Arts Council also is turning 50 years old. And the pandemic also had very visible effects, as mentioned previously. And the question is, what cultural life and what actors have participants have we taken care of, and in spite of this policy we had, what we have is what we have left. The most important question is, what role does this cultural policy play in a big political context? We have these 5 different welfare models. There are many different models. And what function do they have? What resources are being allocated to other parts of the society? At the same time as we hear about that the war in Ukraine is made more visible than the cultural life in our countries, and maybe it is becoming a part of our culture and arts. So we have different aspects of our understanding of supporting culture. I don't have answer, do you? We have different models. Of course, it's very important to reflect.
Been for maybe 20 years, and what would be most important is to invest in the core of the arts and culture. It means what we saw during the pandemic, that the self-employed artists couldn't get along. So I think this is the most important and it is the acute problem, and we should do something about it and renew the infrastructures of the cultural policy. Yes. Well, in Finland we have an infrastructural system that is based on the environment that we had in 1970s, and it still more or less is based on that. And after that, in 1980s, or since 1980s, there has been a huge rise of artist education, and we have a really high level artist education, but the structures have not actually been able to kind of understand how the situation has changed, and we saw it during the pandemic. Yeah.
Så hva tenker du, Benny?
So, Benny, what do you think? You represent a Nordic instrument, representing the Nordic Culture Fund. We've heard a little bit from Finland, a little bit from Sweden, but what do you as a Nordic institution think about cultural policy from a Nordic perspective? Is it appreciated? I would like to comment that there are quite a few people here who have spoken about the historical aspects. I'd like to build on that. The first initiative for the formation of the Nordic Culture Fund came 1 year after World War II, so in 1946. And this was in response to an initiative from the Nordic Ministers of Education, because they thought that after the war had affected all of the Nordic countries, it was important to have an incentive to create a joint set of values and also a joint belief in nature, but that should not be subject to review by the national agendas. And then 20 years later, 1966, that led to the formation of the Nordic Culture Fund. And this was the result of an initiative that started at the Nordic Council of Ministers. And I think that this history really brings out the relevance to the contemporary times that we live in. So the cultural policy hasn't always been there. It was formed at a specific point in time, and we need to look at how can you make it even more relevant. And there is tremendous interest in the cultural policy space, that space that is created by cultural policy. I would like to integrate it, include in that journalism, the media in a larger sense, in a completely new world order that was not there before. There is a need for information, a need for facts, for information. This is important to politics. There are 3,500 popular libraries in the Nordic countries. We're talking about 3,500 libraries. How can we deploy this structure, this infrastructure in a new way? How can we invest in this, and how can we invest most fruitfully? And this, of course, leads me to the next question. Now that you've just, while you have worked with questions at the national level, we have been working on these same questions at the Nordic level, and I do hope that before the next budgets are framed, I hope that there'll be an opportunity to relaunch, to restart culture at the Nordic level, because I think that this has suffered tremendously during the pandemic, just in the same way that cultural policy or cultural activities have been deeply impacted during the pandemic. Right now, there is a sort of post-pandemic slow. But in fact, we are now discovering so much exciting collaboration in the respective countries and at the Nordic level and internationally that really, all of this really deserves being raised up. Now that I'm sitting and listening to the Nordic bridges, I'm thinking here, oh, this is fantastic, but this needs to correspond to the budgets that we have, because the ambitions are ultimately limited by the budgets. And what I see is that this is an area that is truly deserving of investments. In a climate of uncertainty, of instability, in a climate of pandemic, there is a greater than ever need to join up together and to meet and have shared experiences. And we need to really persuade the powers that be that we're working on something truly important for society at large. The fact that we are saying these things here is important, but we need to get other people to say the same thing, because cultural activities are truly worth an investment in the Nordic countries. Why don't we follow the example of Kupara? You said earlier you had a question. Have the cultural sectors, have they recovered? And you said no. I would like to follow that. What about you guys? Do you feel that there is enough willingness to invest in the culture sector? Do you feel that? Kajsa, can I start with you? Oh, when the national budgets invest in cultural activities, well, we have had a budget proposal for next year, and from a Swedish perspective, the cultural budget is at the same level as pre-pandemic, and for the Arts Council Sweden, there are some development contributions that are going to disappear from 2024. There were time-limited funding schemes, so they're going to be phased out from 2024. There's been a lot of discussion about this in Sweden. It was pointed out that there is a need for more support to promote the recovery of the cultural sector, and we have sent the signal that that is not enough. Well, they need to be continued after 2024. We have been pointing this out. We understand that it does need to be reduced or de-escalated. We realize that the cultural sector can't always have these funding schemes just to keep it alive that we had during the pandemic, because the challenges that were there during the pandemic, they're now over, and it must be said to some extent they've even led to developments. New developments have occurred as a result. On the one hand, on the other hand, as Benny said, some of the international networks, that might be Nordic, that might be European or global, they have imploded in this period. It's taken decades to build them up. And now, with the pandemic, they've been razed to the ground because they were based on the efforts and willingness and work of individuals that are no longer willing and no longer able to dedicate these efforts. So there's been a huge loss, both inside countries and also in terms of international collaboration. And of course, us, living in the Nordic countries, we are small countries, and even though it's a fantastic place to be, the Nordics, we need to be aware that we are a tiny part of the world and a tiny communities. Yes, vulnerability. We're truly highlighting vulnerability there.
On cultural policies and sustainability, environmental. Is there a correspondence between that and the will to invest?
Well, actually, there is a lot of talk about the cultural and creative sector, that, there is a future with the creative sector, but there is no idea how to actually invest in it. So at least there is a kind of a gap. And I think this would be one of the most important things, to see how to develop the whole cultural and creative sector in Finland, and how to really invest in it. At the moment, the whole sector has suggested that there should be 100 million euros more to the kind of cultural budget, but I doubt, because of the difficult situation, economic situation, with the next parliament. So we have the war and a new system for the social security areas,
Right.
and so it's quite problematic.
Men nu har vi I hvert fall fått et
But at least we now have had a bit of a snapshot of what the picture's like in Finland, Sweden, and the Nordics. But I would like to move on to a cultural policy goal that has been pervasive ever since cultural policy was first saw light. And this is also part of our own mission statement for the Arts Council of Norway, and that is that art and cultural activities should reach out to as many people as possible. And this is, of course, part of the reason why our council was established just after World War II. I'd like to speak with you, Christina, from the Sami Council. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the Sami Council first? I'm not sure that everybody is so familiar with your activities. The Sami Council is the Sami's non-profit cooperation organization.
Goes over Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia. You were founded in 1986, so you're older than Arts Council Norway. You were there before us, and one of the goals is to safeguard language, identity, and rights across the state borders, and of course visualize Sami culture and language in our society. And in Arts Council Norway, we have worked on availability and visibility, and one of our studies showed that Sami artists were challenged by having access to the public cultural life. If this trend goes on, what dangers are you facing? So what's it's a very leading and relevant question. Yes, our experience shows that Sami cultural and artistic life is awakening a big interest, and Sami culture, like institutions that work with promoting Sami culture, like Film Institute and festivals and literature centers, they all report on an increasing demand and at the same time lack of resources. It is difficult to handle the increasing demand. So what we are losing on the way is that Sami culture is becoming the most important export commodity from the Nordic countries, and we have to lift up the Sami culture altogether. And I also would like to comment on a support scheme. Sami Council sees that Sami artists and cultural workers find it difficult to navigate among national support schemes, and there is a need for support that is so given to the language and cultural competence, and therefore Sami artists prefer Sami support schemes, even though those Sami support schemes cannot give the bigger amounts. So my message today is that we need strong support schemes for Sami people, for Sami artists, just to elevate the level of ambition. Yeah. But you say that Sami culture and language have experienced like a raise, but also in terms of demand internationally in Venezia Biennale, and also other demand. So something has been done right. What more can we do right? There are two examples I would like to talk about today. One thing happened this Friday. We watched Katarina Barok. It was a prime time TV show in the Norwegian TV channel, and it was a cool event. The Katarina Barok was talking about Sami language and making a giving a fantastic performance during the prime time on TV. At the same time, it was a very a good illustration of how we practice our culture. It was natural for Sami culture, for Sami TV, was to as equally as it was in Finnish or Swedish side. So there is a space of possibilities that may be limited by the national policies. In addition, I wanted to, since we have enough of time, to mention another example. Britta Markat Labba recently told me, when I met her in Oslo, that she had visited a Norwegian parliament that purchased her art. And we met each other in the artist's house where she presented her new documentary. Britta told me that in 2016, what is her big breakthrough, and since then she has been working non-stop. And this proves, to my opinion, that initiative and work that has been put down by the Office of Contemporary Art has really brought some fruits, not only for the Sami culture but also for the artistic life in general. So this is something I believe we here have to bring further. We need alliances. And the next step could be creating a joint strategy on elevating Sami culture and language in an even stronger way, because there is a gigantic interest. Yes, and this is a good way, greeting to people present here, to welcome. Northern House, you are representing that, Christina. It consists of Nordic institutions and foundations, and you work in Reykjavik. And you work as an established working place for the Northern culture, and you represent diversity. It is interesting what is differing. We're talking about differences and not that much about similarities. But would you describe how this diversity is being taken care of and developed further. Because the house you were built, it was built in 1968. Well, I got a wrong date. Okay, the Nordic diversity has started that year. Yes, a historical perspective shows that Reykjavik is one of the first Nordic cultural institution founded in 1968 when Iceland was facing westwards. And other Western countries or Nordic countries saw the possibility of building the bridge between Iceland and the rest of the world, and there was a dialogue and people making bridges on a personal level as well. So they have created a Nordic meeting place, and I have very warm feelings to the place where I work, but we need even warmer contact between our countries. So what we do today is asking who is Nordic countries, what are our ambitions. We are working towards a Vision 2030. It's an interesting work by itself. When we focus on diversity and inclusion and availability. Cultural institutions work with inclusion and very often from the perspective of the audience. We have some certain target groups that will participate in our programs. At the same time, it concerns inclusion. How can we influence? What can we do? We can revise our programs, our participants, structure our institutions, who works in our institutions, and Nordic cooperation has to be centralized. Like in Iceland, we have a big share of foreign nationals. This is a kind of new phenomenon. And there are countries who have longer experience and bigger perspective. And it will be easier what works well and what can work better. At the same time, in our house in Reykjavik, we would like to become an example of inclusion. This work is strategic, and our colleagues work with curators towards Iran and Ukraine and creating exhibitions and other programs. And also working towards young people, children and youth. We have different groups that we have a school from like French school, and outside of central Reykjavik, some pedagogical projects, other children's projects that also works on. It's a 1-year lasting program to create a meeting place for children, including their parents as well.
To the parents, cut the parents, all the kinds of things that kids get to do when they get to decide. We have worked with the Lithuanian communities, which are quite a large community in Reykjavik, so we're working with the schools where these children are. And we've also worked with the Ukrainian community that we have on Iceland. Because obviously there's been quite a large immigration from Ukraine due to the war. And as I mentioned, these different groups, and we're not including them in just in a symbolic fashion. No, we're truly integrating them in our work. They're deeply involved also in other programs. So this is a true collaboration. But I'm thinking of, the question of the Nordic diversity is very different from what it was when our respective institutions were established. It's developed and changed over time. So it's important for a new vision for 2030, because the ambition then is to be the most inclusive and most sustainable community. But this is a truly hairy goal, I think we can say. But let me go back to the arts councils and the instruments and the funds at your fingertips. I would like to hear more about your dilemmas. Is there a dilemma? If we're going to have more people that we want to include in our cultural activities, does that mean that somebody has to exit the scene? No, I think the challenge associated with the Nordic, or for that matter, the European perspective, is that it's so easy to not see the obvious things just because one's so focused on one's own country. One might be very governed by one's national perspective and lose out on other perspectives. How can we make sure that we have meetings where we can integrate not just the Swedish important players, but also the Nordic players? And I must be honest, we weren't very good at that before the pandemic, and I'm sad to say that we haven't really improved with the pandemic. So it's important to keep, not to reinforce that sort of nationalistic process too much in the process. It just gets too difficult to include everybody. No, we need to raise our gaze, and it is important that we are infected by each other's ideas. We need to be mutually inspired. We need to look around and look for other inspiring ideas, among other things in the Sami community. What exciting things are going on in the cultural activities there, and also other indigenous groups' cultural activities, and what's been going on there germinating for a long time. And that is really where we stand to gain so much. Perhaps if I call it an awakening, perhaps that sounds too religious, but I certainly think there's a tremendous potential there to be inspired and spark off new developments. And I think we can learn from, for instance, the Sami way of cooperating. We need to look beyond our national perspective. We need to take the Nordic perspective, the European perspective, the global perspective. There is a true need for this. Okay, there's a certain mistranslation here between the Norwegian, Swedish versions of the same words. We have the same discussion going on in Norway here. We also want to work to promote diversity, to include people more, to have greater equality of opportunities. I mean, after all, our Minister of Culture is also the Minister of Equality. And then there was the report from Sweden last year called Sophia Constant. I would like to ask you, are there any dilemmas between the question of wanting to put into practice a cultural policy and yet wish to preserve free art? Oh, this is a really, really exciting way of asking the question. Well, it was a bit of a fint, really. I thought I'd trick you. I'm throwing that particular ball to you. I wanted to say something else first. You may say that first, but you have to answer my question. What has happened? The fact that meetings were restructured due to the pandemic. We have found that the different countries then are meeting in new ways. I can see that. The Nordic countries are always talking about everybody and how do we work together. That's sort of the discourse in the Nordic meetings. But recently, I was at a meeting between Denmark and Sweden. And there the focus was on how to develop the bilateral cooperation. And the week before that, I met the Norwegian ambassador in Stockholm. And they wanted to do things the exact same way. But they wanted to focus on a bilateral Norwegian-Swedish cooperation, that being the longest border in all of Europe. So really, you're quite right. Well, this pandemic has shown us that we really need to raise our gaze. We need to acquire new perspective. We need to do new things. So what do you want us to do, she asks. I think it's a pity that we're now in a situation where we have to ask each other these questions. Why do we have to level questions at each other? That is really sad. I mean, if we look at the budget discussion at the Nordic level, this sort of counterculture question, how can we ask each other these questions, given that we know that everybody here is fully aware, everybody here is fully informed of the fact You know, we know that in this industry, people are quick on their feet. You know, there's a high level of activity. People are creative. They think of new things to do all the time. You know, developments are so fast in this sector. It is just plain stupid to level questions against one another. I mean, we may well have ambitious targets. We should raise questions, but we can't have the campaigns and the questions, we have to pose them in a more complex manner. We need to remember that we need to fathom broadly in our questions, taking into account diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, nationality, geography, distances. I mean, you talk about children and young people, and I'm thinking, well, it's more than children and young people. We're talking boys, girls, and then there are those that want to be non-binary. There are young children, and then you've got 18, 20-year-olds. I mean, even that one group, children and young people, that's a hugely diverse group. We need to have a greater awareness of the multifaceted nature of the things we're talking about. We must not simplify the questions in our work. I think that this is a question of unfolding, the diversity of each group. So, Kaiser, you too are saying that we need to think more broadly, and then one looks at the most exciting things that emerge at each point, and then one gives the funding to the most exciting ideas. And you are saying that, Benny, you're saying that we should not sort of let the best be the enemy of the good, you know. Well, for me, you know, the budget, we're talking about minus 26% in my budget over a 4-year period. That's a huge decline. So this is truly an equation that is just not going to work itself out. These budget cuts do not reflect the vision of culture being important to the Nordic countries being the world's most inclusive, integrated, and sustainable region. So there's a discrepancy there between the budgets and the ambitions.
More inclusion, more diversity. Is there anyone that needs to be opted out? Or is this a continuous development of the artistic direction in Finland?
In Finland, we have a very big discussion going on about the diversity, and we are not so well. It's also quite recent discussion in Finland, or more recent than, for example, in Sweden. But at the moment, it's very, very hot discussion, and we are in Taike, for example, we are trying to kind of include the diversity in all our operations. So it's starting to change.
Tida flyr jo når vi har det
time
gøy.
flows. And when we have
minutter
fun,
og
we have
23
only 7 minutes left. So I would like now to ask you, every single one, whether you have faith in the Nordic cultural cooperation, and what would we dream of the initiatives or contributions or maybe ideas or maybe parts from others cooperations or political initiatives. I know you have prepared yourself, so it's don't look surprised. So let's look back on the Nordic cooperation. It has been good, but the challenges are how shall we handle it in future? What is your dream, Christina? Well, where shall we start? Well, we have a think tank in Sami. We have a report. Maybe you can start there. Yes. What we see is that during this diversity discussion, that there is a bigger window of understanding Sami field of culture as a border crossing field, and this is good and a perspective that we welcome. As you have mentioned, Kristin, our council have established this think tank and also separate institutions and cultures, artists, and we see that this culture policies are very challenging for Sami cultural practice that flows very naturally across the borders. We see culture takes form in different places, and it is a challenge for the artistic freedom, which is a founding principle in the Nordic culture policy. So my or our hope primarily would be that Norwegian cultural authorities can come together and sit around the table and see how can we adjust, maybe start talking about this. How can we adjust Sami cultural policy to the culture of Sami? Because still there is an expectation on that the Sami culture can be supported in the same way as provided by the national cultural policy. But our experience is different. Well, I would like to give the microphone to other places while we are talking about culture. Sweden. Okay, we're coming to that table with a coffee cup, a cup of coffee, right? Yes, we will. Representation in all Nordic institutions. So the population has to be represented. Also Norwegian welfare cooperation. So after that period of lockdowns, this has to be resurrected and reconstructed and prioritized in terms of funding so that our artists can do their work. Hi, Sam. What is important for the future is to ask what kind of role do the bigger institutions have in the creating cultural field. Maybe they have a different way of contributing than technical companies, for example supporting Sami filmmaking. Public culture policy has 3 different levels in Sweden at least, and recently we were in Mexico City. We have had this UNESCO meeting, and 130 ministers of culture were discussing the role of culture. Well, in Sweden, there was not a line in mass media about that. So, whole country, whole fellowship, we cannot a little bubble. We are a part of a bigger society. We have to handle it jointly and also unite our resources. Yes, purposefulness of the public funding. Yes, 3 points. Britta Marakatlava. The 3 days of presenting in the parliament. How can I call my exhibition? Exhibition Bassanole? Well, how is done? That's strange. Sharp needles. Sorry. So, yes, because our cultural policy has to be sharp, and there are arenas, new arenas, and they have to be applied in new ways. It may be a book fair in Gothenburg, for example. Next year there may be a joint Norwegian and Swedish fair, new arenas, and also make them visible, the existing arenas and new arenas, to visualize, to talk about them, and lift them up on the higher level. And the third point is the Norwegian Prime Minister that was in Helsingfors. This was a part of his cultural policy. And this may be revised and who is making the decision?
Yeah, what do you dream of?
Jag har bara en fråga. Varför
I
konstnärer
have only
får inte
one question.
lön?
Why do artists
So
not
my
have
dream is
salaries?
that maybe we could try to develop together, try a kind of experiment. Maybe we could pay salaries to a certain amount of artists, free artists, for their kind of artistic thinking and artistic work, and try out and find judicial things during this experiment. So I would suggest this kind of experiment.
And this echoes really what we learned in Mexico City on art, cultural rights for everyone and artists' rights, and to have proper pay for artistic work, which is the core of all cultural life. Now it's blinking. Men kort oppsummert.
Well, to make a short summary, better cooperation between the countries in SAPMI, it's a priority number one. One, increase value of northern culture. This is something that is disappearing from our view. We have to support by public support schemes, and all this with the cultural policies has to be sharp. So we look forward to hearing more about that. So I hope we have covered some of the dilemmas. Thank you very much for your contributions to the panel.
Hello, can you hear us?
for our contemporaneous art was closed. But we must admit that the money has flown back to where it was meant to start in the beginning, basically to the artists themselves and the many, many funding schemes that there are. I will answer 3 questions that I tried to shed some light on during the day today. Can Nordic myths and realities be discussed? Can there be a theme of art? Yes, is the answer, clearly. Do Nordic artists like to be categorized and labeled as, here you see one Nordic artist? And the answer to that is very much no. Is there still hope for the Nordic cooperation? The answer to that is yes, but it would be much better if there were also a Nordic art policy. It is my pleasure now to introduce Hilde Sandvik. She will be doing 2 things today. First of all, she will be challenging, put on the spot, politicians from the Nordic countries and Sápmi, asking them difficult questions. Then she will be leading what I think we can call the special version of the radio program, the Norwegian, the Swedish, the Swede, and the Dane, which is a program that she makes for radio. Hilde, where are you? Hilde Sandvik, welcome on stage. Thank you, and thank you for being so efficient now at the end of a long and stimulating day. I'm sure people are now sitting comfortably on their seats. And I would like to immediately invite Minister Anette Trettebergstuen up here on one of these very comfy chairs. We have also Maja Christina Jorma, the representative of the Executive Council of the Sámi Parliament, and we have with us Why don't we start with you, Annette? I have heard the word Nordic, I don't know, has it been said 500 times today? Well, it is a Nordic conference. Well, that may be so, but what I think when I hear the word Nordic is, it is that primarily it is a geographic dimension. It is because we are up here at the tip of the world, and in this very situation where we are today, that is why there is pressure being put on our boundaries. We are in the world's most equal countries, countries that enjoy the most trust, even though it must be said, I'm sorry, the Danes are dropping on the democracy index. Have you seen that? They're really, borderline undemocratic in Denmark, I must say. And you won't find this in the script I made out, but I haven't heard a single word being said about the fact that the global situation today is completely different to what it was before. I think it has been mentioned. I think there was some references to that. But it is very true what you're saying there, Hilde. I think the world that we find ourselves in today, it is completely topsy-turvy. And this challenges us in the Nordic countries. It challenges our shared values, things that before we could take for granted, freedom, democracy, what we like to call the Nordic values. But our neighboring countries are in a very different situation. Our neighborhood with Russia has become very tense. And I would argue that the current situation highlights even more clearly the need for a close cooperation among the Nordic countries. So if anything, the current situation has done much to promote Nordic cooperation, and this is where culture is perhaps the glue or the foundation wall, the cornerstone of the Nordic collaboration. Yes, well, but I get the sense, I have the feeling that the ministers of defense, they're always talking to, they're in frequent contact. I see that the ministers of health have also been working very closely with each other. But as for the ministers of culture, if you look back to the time when Norway's had the presidency, what do you think will be, what can you pass on? What can you say? This is something that Norway achieved while we held the presidency. I think we've achieved several things when we move on to sort of making up status. But we're not ending the Norwegian presidency and then moving on to a different presidency, which Iceland will be running. No, no, no. There are long, continuous lines that will permeate the Norwegian and the Icelandic presidency. There are no sharp boundaries there. In the Nordic countries, we have a high level of freedom of the press. We are highly democratic. We score highly for freedom of expression. I'm not saying we should take this for granted, but we should be aware of the fact that we do score highly. We mark boundaries in relation to the tech giants. The tech giants, they really are putting pressure on our small linguistic groups. And not least, tech giants are also challenging free press. But, we have lots of interesting work combating that. We've got a think tank coming with interesting proposals in March. And I think that area, that is one of the areas, defending freedom of expression, freedom of the press, will be very important at the time going forward. And I'm so pleased to see that we're now seeing the fruits of projects such as Nordic bridges. We see more and more Nordic artists and other cultural workers. I hear of so many people who've been involved in some capacity. They've developed some contact. They've got one foot in the door through, for instance, this Nordic bridges project. So I see so many examples of seeds germinating and bearing fruit. Okay, but have things become more or less Nordic? More, says Minister Trettebergstuen. Why? Asks Hilde Sandvik. Well, I've been a politician for many years. I've had some years working with the Nordic Council. But being allowed to work on the question of equality and culture in the Nordic Council of Ministers has truly offered some insight how concrete, how hands-on this Nordic collaboration can be, and the tremendous potential that resides in it. Not only in the last 12-month period, and not, when we first met in the Nordic Council of Ministers, we really gained a lot from discussing the situation in the other countries. We were on the phone to each other in the evenings all the time, asking, what's happening in your country? What are you doing? So that was really helpful, but not least that really sort of held up a mirror in terms of different opportunities for doing things. I've become more Nordic. I'm a real Nordista. So you are my kind of favorite member of this panel, Christine Jomma, and that's not, I don't mean to insult anybody, but that is because there's one thing that's so important to you, and that is you really want to focus on the Sami aspect, and you really want the Sami aspect to work on a broader geographical area. But you said that this was complicated too much during the COVID pandemic. From your point of view, what do you take home from this day today? Were you disillusioned, or what are you taking home from this day today? Well, what I think is that if we can follow up on what was said today, then that would be fantastic. We, the Sami, we transgress boundaries. We are cross-boundary people every day. So to us, this is good news. We must acknowledge, and I hope the states also are willing to acknowledge that Sami art is a cross-boundary thing by nature, and we need more of that. That would be good for us. Investing in a Sami project and in Sami artists, those kinds of investments are good for cross-national projects and for all of Sami, but it would also bring great benefits to cultural institutions that can collaborate across borders. And of course, it's good for indigenous peoples. There's a question I just had to ask you on one of the breaks. We had a representative on the stage earlier today, and when the Nordic British representative, she started with this tribute to the indigenous peoples, and I thought, oh, I don't know, does this work, or is it cringeworthy, or what exactly is this? What do you think? I was touched. So I would like to thank her for this. I'd like to thank her for the recognition that Norway is a Sami country and that the Sami people have rights here. So that is a deeply meaningful, very warming appreciation. And this is meaningful to hear this in the countries where we, the Sami, are are administered by other nations. We, the Sami people, are experiencing great pressure, but our culture, our languages, and our land are all under pressure. So, to me, that was very good and very meaningful. Sápmi is also in Russia, and what does that mean now? Well, what's happened now has made it very difficult for us as a people, because we are a people who reside in Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. And with the war, obviously there are huge restrictions on our cooperation. For so many years, we have worked to expand, develop, enhance cross-border collaboration, and now we see that our brothers and sisters are cut off from our cooperation. Annette, in the meantime, while we try to get Iceland online, could you tell me what Christina Joma is really saying, that these small things bear the seeds of big things, you know? I mean, you know, the small things such as that a Norwegian publisher, if you want to sell a book in Denmark, it just becomes too expensive. You know, it's these nitty-gritty things that complicate things. Can these kinds of things be raised in the presidency? Or are you more sort of all about the overarching structures? Well, there are many presidents. Here's Iceland! Iceland is with us! Well, certainly we have Icelandic sound. Now we had an echo not in your head, but we all heard the echo, says Hilda. The minister will continue. We have to remember that the Nordic Council of Ministers doesn't only work on culture. The basic idea of the Nordic Council of Ministers is to have a borderless Nordic. So we keep on working on how to get rid of these borders. We're always trying to find out how to get the different systems to communicate better, to work better together, not only how the different publishing industries work. But we keep on trying to identify things that prevent cooperation as per today, and then we seek to resolve these issues. So the Nordic Council of Ministers does have in it the potential to transform these things.
Happens in Sápmi and Sámi culture policy. Do you have a faith, or do you have an imagination how we can put it together? Absolutely. And there is an enormous development potential to elevate the Sámi culture and language. And I do hope that these institutions are made to do that, to see the potential and to involve themselves more in this field of work. And it will generate results. And I believe that we only have results to expect. And it will make a bigger difference for the Sami artistic life. What happens also in the framework of the Nordic cooperation and also ministers of culture bring along a certain inspiration in our work. For example, in the Norwegian Ministry of Culture, we have started the bilateral cooperation with Canada on culture exchange, focusing on Sami and the Arctic perspective. So this very perspective also happens in terms of our common interests on the Nordic level. When it comes to Sami culture, if you have read Aftenposten today, but Sami culture is being focused on. It's not about the budget, by the way it is has been fulfilled. Well, I'm not speaking about that. No. Okay, I thank you very much. We have the Norwegian, the Danish, and the Swedish tearing each other apart. I don't know whether you know or not what's going to happen, whether you're going to regret. But thank you very much to you. And we do hope that Iceland is coming stronger. Next seminar, next opportunity. So maybe we're just going to say that. Oh.
Hello. Great to see you, colleagues, and thanks for an extremely interesting panel that you have here. And I think just as opening remarks on our intervention here from Reykjavik, Iceland, is that I think one of the things that the pandemic really taught us was that, culture is so important, not just for, as a nation, like a cultural heritage, but everyday culture. And it's one of the best ways to, make the society more whole and integrated if we focus on culture. And one of the things that we did here in Iceland is like we really kind of build an economic bridge over this difficult time and focused on culture. And we're actually putting extra efforts into culture, even though we are, running a budget that has its challenges, as in every country, with inflation going up and a horrible war in Ukraine, which we all feel miserable about, because it's really changing the world, the world that we know. However, what we're trying to do here, and we so much appreciate also all the Nordic cooperation that we have in place, is like we're making a policy on each art form or industry. We're making a policy on the film industry. We just passed a law here, a new law on music, like a holistic approach, and we are implementing a new music center, which is first time in our country's history. And we're taking each art form and making like a policy on visual arts, on design, and performing arts. And we're hoping at the end of the next 2 or 3 years, we'll have a really holistic approach that will enrich our country's culture. We're talking about okay. Great.
I'm sorry, but we're not expecting you to come up with something very genius for the next year, since you're not going to take the leadership. So
yes.
That's what we will wait for, and perhaps come back next year and talk about it.
Okay, great. So maybe just like a final concluding remarks is like what we're going to focus during our chairmanship is going to be like the green Nordic region, competitive Nordic region, and socially sustainable Nordic. Otherwise, I'll just say, hafið það gott, takk kærlega fyrir þennan frábæra fund, við sjáum síðar, bless.
And I do apologize again for skipping over some people. Entering late, but this is the digital world. So please enter the world, the Danish, the Swedish, and the Norwegian. Welcome to the stage. Well, we don't have time to this battle now. Once again, these people should have been welcomed properly, but they were waiting in line and waiting for these people without boundaries. But this should have been, the Nordic top-level summit. But no Swedish, no Danish, no Finnish. And people from Finland, but not the minister, but because they look forward to the Europe, because there was another summit in Europe. We didn't know about that. Yes. Yeah, I don't really understand that. No. So they should have preferred this summit instead of another summit. Of course, it could be very.
To prove that it's ridiculous that Norway's being kept out of the EU. I mean, we've got Finland and Sweden into NATO, and Norway continues outside the EU. Where's the logic of that? Come on, let's get Norway into the EU. every time I say this on the radio, people tell me off so badly. You know, there is no popular opinion. You know, the public opinion is not in favor of joining the EU. You may not believe it, but that is actually the fact. Well, I suppose Norway lacks the economic incentive. I think that's the problem. So what would we say about this sense of Nordic solidarity? You've been sitting at the back. I don't know, who would like to enter the lines then first? Well, you can say that whoever is interested in the Nordic cooperation is primarily women, and the Danish are not so keen, because I am generally the only Dane. You know, we have 2 secret representatives in the Nordic office, because they all go around speaking Norwegian. I'm the only Dane there. But I've promised not to identify them here in public, or at least not today. And I'm sorry, the people who live in Copenhagen, aren't they mostly Swedes? I have met Swedish people here today who live in Copenhagen. They do have a tendency to do that. It's very, very positive that everybody is so positive to art and culture. It's wonderful to hear it. It's a wonderful experience. Everybody thinks that art and culture are important. And for us artists, you know, it's great that there is a bureaucracy that is there wants to help us, that they're willing to, you know, we feel that we artists, we feel that we're funding your bureaucrats because we're giving you jobs, basically. And I would like to add, I'm just going to summarize something here. This is from their papers, actually. These are papers that sent me beforehand. It says here that, it says, art is the pillar that holds our society together, improves interpersonal communication, and Nordic culture creates space for diversity and differences and development, and reflects our joint values, and art and culture constitute the cornerstone. Was there a lot more? Any more cliches coming? Oh, there's tons. I mean, as an artist, I feel a bit stressed. You know, all of these duties, all these obligations being generated. What happens to free art? I mean, you are setting up a very tight framework here that is not allowing me to be creative at all. Sorry to tell you that. I mean, I'm meant to provide for sustainability, equality, diversity. One of the questions here was, how is Nordic cultural cooperation able to provide for sustainability, equality, and also assure the freedom of expression for artists? How are they able to do all of that? Well, I come from Sweden. In Sweden, we have decided that cultural life has been politicized. I thought what Jonas Ekeberg was really exciting. You know, what he said, he spoke about this conference in Copenhagen in 1810. I thought that was fascinating, when the state decided that the artist should paint Norse mythology, and the artist said, no, I don't want to. Then they went ahead and did it anyway. But I had this feeling of, oh my God, we've been here before. I mean, in Sweden, you know, artists are expected to be pro-LGBTQ. That's an important perspective to bear in mind for artists. All kinds of other obligations and duties imposed on the artist. Perhaps what I'm providing here is a bit of a caricature, but it does say here, I'm quoting now, the artist should promote climate, sustainability, democracy, and today there was a new word. When Jonas Wendel's speech was read out, artists are now also responsible for civil preparedness and emergency preparedness. I mean, I'm sorry, sure, this is too much. The artists are given more and more responsibilities that really exceed the remit of the artist. In Sweden, you know, a report was published in 2021, I think it was published. And there was a question about that report today, actually. And he didn't answer the question. Did he not want to answer it, perhaps? Anyway, the question was, how free is Swedish art? And it turns out that many artists, Swedish artists, actually feel as if they're asphyxiated. They feel as if they're being controlled. They apply for funds to do art projects. And, you know, to be honest, this is quite a complicated setup. I mean, really full of pitfalls. because the government's objectives keep, they keep on changing. But what I wanted to say about Sweden is that Sweden is politically and ideologically, Sweden is a deeply divided country. So at the moment, it's the progressive middle class that is deciding what the cultural policy should be. But I'm not sure it's going to go on that. I'm not sure that the middle class will always be managing that. The Dane says, "Well, don't look at me. I'm not middle class. I'm not middle class." I was hoping that the Nordic Council of Ministers, I was hoping that they could be my salvation, because the Danish system, the Danish system expects me to meet all kinds of requirements, and that is not in line with the art that I want to produce, I'm afraid. So there are all these different committees under the Danish state fund, but my work is not aligned with the fund's guidelines. So, should have been 10%, there's 10% effort and 5% speculation. Then there's 90% luck. Okay, so they're struggling here. That the Danish way of counting is a bit like French. So we need that the Norwegian. I know that the Norwegian Oil Fund is investing in Dutch windmills. So to be honest, I had hoped that I'd hoped that Nordic cultural policy would have a certain understanding for the fact, we artists, we need to be protected from state intervention. What we dream about, we want to live freely. We want the Nordic Council of Ministers to give us a freedom package, a ticket to freedom. We want to be protected from the state, and we want to enjoy artistic freedom. So our great hope and our prayer to you politicians and bureaucrats is that we should be protected from the bureaucrats. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm getting quite confused with all the different Nordic council. No, now I'm talking about the Nordic Culture Fund. They have actually omitted applying, objectives. They have fewer criteria for us to stick to. I don't know, they're referring back to the Kalmar Union with their objectives. I'm sorry, I looked at these papers and not a word was said about quality, I noticed. No, nothing about quality, nothing about objectives, nothing about independence, nothing about freedom. There's nothing about being controversial, there's nothing about rebellion. Not a single word about these things which to us artists, these are things that we long for. We want to be free, we want to be rebellious, we want to be controversial. If we are going to be loyal to our artistic inner, then we can't be bound by cultural policy objectives. I mean, it's all very well for cultural policy to say that they want to promote minority groups, that they should be allowed to express themselves. That's great, but how are we going to achieve that? I mean, this is a real paradox. And I think it's so odd that one doesn't discuss this paradox. I was the editor of the Swedish broadsheet for many years, and I tried to generate this discussion, but there was no interest in discussing the absence of minority representatives in the cultural field. Mostly it was the Swedish Conservative Party that wanted to discuss this, but nobody else was really interested in that particular public debate. Then we had that report, the Sophia Art report that was published. And then everybody wanted to say, oh, that was really stupid, they said it was all terrible. But until the report was published, nobody was interested in it. Then they were very happy to criticize it. In Sweden, we're great at reports and studies. Sweden is excellent at these reports, but they just never achieve anything. I mean, there's such a sense of achievement in being able to present a report, but this shows us ultimately that cultural journalists, they're complete opportunities, because they didn't say a word. These journalists, they didn't say a word until the report was published, and then they were more than happy to criticize it. I mean, and the report sort of listed all of these things about equality, LGBTQ policies, and I'm all for it. That is also the politics that I defend. But art must be free. It's very embarrassing to enter these cultural institutions and to see that everybody there is just the same. It's completely homogeneous. Isn't that a bit strange? Is that odd? Or don't you care about that? What do you mean, that they're all middle class, all women? Oh God, they're all women, they're all 55. Well, Hassan, what is it like for you? What do you feel as part of this diversity industry? I was an active player in what I used to call the integration industry. That's what I called it before I left it. I broke out from it, in fact. To me, it was terrible to be categorized that way. No, not just terrible, because I must say I made a lot of money from it, so it wasn't that bad. You know, there were so many funds for integration projects, and, you know, I could just dip into those funds and suck money out of it. Oh, no, 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 you're giving me pictures in my head. I don't want them. I don't want these pictures. Please, please, rephrase that. You spoke about your brown Russell dipping into the treasury. That gave me pictures I didn't want. Did the interpreter use the word brown Russell? Did she? Well, well. I had a meeting on this very stage just a few weeks ago, and I met the Norwegian Pakistani writer Sejan Shakar, who wrote 3 amazing books, formidable books. The 3rd book is about to be published. We met not because he's a Danish Pakistani. We met because there was a different kind of relationship between us, and that was about being able to perspectivize the culture that one lives on the basis of a certain point of view. And that was the point of departure, because I come from an upper-class family from Copenhagen, or I could be from the ghetto. But even so, this was a completely unpredictable meeting. Because, you know, one can discuss whether my art is good or bad, but we met because, you know, it was an interesting meeting. It was with 2 artists who met and had a conversation, and that was the only premise for our meeting. And I wish that you, who exercise cultural policy, could let go, get rid of all these formulations about what we should achieve, and let us do our stuff. We don't want to be hugged to death by cultural policy. Right, because on top of the fact that there are all these fine, fancy words, then there is the artist who has to achieve all of these things, and this artist is left to be very, very poor. And suddenly I had before my inner eye this very poverty-stricken artist who's trying to achieve equality and trying to find sustainability bits and bobs, and I don't know, I felt a bit sorry for this artist. What do you think? I thought it was quite interesting when we're talking about the structure of cultural policy and just how vulnerable the artists are when there is a pandemic, when there is a war, and then suddenly that money is gone. Suddenly those structures don't work anymore. Certainly in Sweden that was the case. It just didn't work. We who are cultural journalists, I talked about this as I walked in here. But we are rubbish. We journalists, we are rubbish at cultural policy. I must be honest, we're just rubbish. You know, we had a director in cultural policy who said, well, I want to be best at cultural policy in Sweden. And indeed, a new Swedish report was generated. Oh my God, another report. Can you imagine? Okay, and they said the libraries are very important, and they said the children and young people are important, and all the usual stuff was babbled. But there was a failure to look at what the structures actually look at. There was just a discussion about, is culture free or not? Everybody's unhappy with the cultural budget. Everybody's unhappy with the cultural policy. It doesn't matter which cultural policy we have. Everybody's unhappy anyway. I'm sure it's no fun for the representatives of the authorities because it must be acknowledged they do a very important work. I feel great humility. I feel great gratitude that there are bureaucrats out there who can administer and manage the system. But we are now moving into times of austerity. I'm a bit worried. I mean, my permanent employer, they're cutting down. But let's put it this way. Art has been created before on a shoestring. Don't pursue that line of thinking. Don't pursue that line of thinking. Well, I'm trying to start every single sentence by saying yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. And all these Norwegians that write to me and say, can you please stop starting every sentence with yes, but I just can't let it be. Yes, but is my response to everything. So, yes, but the pandemic was nothing compared to what I and what we artists have experienced in the time that is starting now, that we're looking at now. I mean, there is some attention given to us because people don't want to miss us. I mean, they want our services. But now, now that we've had these changes of habit, now it's kind of formalized that people can't be bothered to go to the theatre anymore. I mean, we are, well, I wouldn't say that we're hunger-stricken, but I suppose that goes with the image of the artist. But actually, I must say, I am very, very concerned about 2023. I'm very worried about my mortgage. I'm very worried about rising expenses. But in Danish history, you mentioned this Jonas guy. So anyway, in 1810, when that meeting was held at the Academy, that is actually the golden age of Danish art. For Danish art and culture, that was the golden age around 1810. And that, in fact, that golden age followed on the biggest financial crack in Danish history ever. Denmark basically went bankrupt. We lost Norway to Sweden, as you remember, in 1814. But please, we were married to you for 400 years. That was long enough, wasn't it? Those are your words, he says. And in those years, in that time of crisis, in the early 19th century, that is when Denmark goes through its cultural golden age. We have all these megastars, and they came out of a period of famine, basically, and produced amazing art. We've got Kierkegaard, Hans Christian Andersen, Erdensleg. They all come from that time, which was basically a time of famine, of absolute despair. People had no work, no income. Anything Denmark has ever created comes from that golden age. So you're saying it was generated by hunger? Basically, yes. So to be honest, I think 2023 is going to be my year. That's the year I'm going to break through, because I'm going to be very hungry. We have just barely 1 minute left, but to me it seems that everything points in the direction that we need a new Kalmar Union between Norway, Denmark and Sweden. And where do you think the capital should be? Huh? Which country gets the capital? Well, it has to be Kalmar, obviously. Perhaps Örebro, because that is, the most central geographically. I was so reminded of Reykjavik and the Nordic house in Reykjavik in Iceland. I mean, of course, it's the only place one wants to be. Hilda says, well, I feel panic when I'm on an island. Oh no, in my imagination, my dreams, I often see Reykjavik before the eyes of my dream. Reykjavik? That is interesting, he says. Hassan says, I'm sorry, surely the capital of the Kalmar Union was in Copenhagen, so we don't need to do that again. I think we should place it somewhere else. Or you can put it on a small Swedish village. Oh, there's this tiny, tiny town that has produced this amazing Swedish Nazi punk band called by the name of Ultimate Tool. Why don't we make that town the capital of the Kalmar Union? That would be controversial, and we want art to be controversial, don't we? But is it in Sweden? Well, I think it should be in Bergen, says Hilda. Of course, Hilda has a Bergen dialect. But now I really feel that I'm so happy that Finland is where they are, in terms of what boundary. It's not that I want Helsinki to be the capital, but I want the Finns, they are our big buffer, aren't they? They have the most sisu. I totally agree with the Finnish representative. Helsinki is a wonderful city. It is a beautiful city. Hassan says Helsinki is a wonderful compromise. Hilda says we've decided Finland and Helsinki will be the capital of the new Kalmar Union. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Camilla and Hassan Preisler. And I would like to just summarize every whole conference, but I will skip that. So thank you to all the contributors, all the presenters on the stage. Thank you for the audience. Thanks for those who are going to listen to this today and in future. And two small details. These badges, please hand it back. We are just taking care of our resources. And take food with you home if you can bear it. Thank you.